Good evening. I see we still have a fairly nice amount of people in the audience. We've heard a lot today about the inexorable growth of oil demand in the decades to come. And indeed, the business as usual scenario of the International Energy Agency tells us that oil demand is expected to grow by about 1% per year to 2040, which means about 500,000 to 1 million barrels per day every year of new production and demand. Still, there are other scenarios like the IEA's 450 scenario, which was designed, which is what we would need to get close to the 2-degree target to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And that scenario tells us that oil demand should decrease by approximately 0.5% on 1% per year from now to 2040, which means between 500,000 and 1 million barrels per day every year. Is this an unrealistic scenario? Probably. But still, there's a big climate conference is going to open in less than 2 months in Paris, and countries are currently submitting commitments. And a calculation was done last week and published last week saying that the commitments we currently have from all the countries which have submitted, and we still have some countries missing, would lead to about 2.7 degrees warming, which is not the desired 1.5 to 2 degrees, but it's much better than the business as usual 3.5 scenario. So we're getting closer to it. Maybe we're entering a big transition in the energy and the oil and gas sector. And what can the oil and gas industry do? We were just told by the gentleman from Statoil what one option is to try to stay strong in oil and gas, trying to make oil and gas production cleaner, maybe diversify into renewable energy. That's one option. There are several other options, and I have the pleasure and the honor to introduce tonight to you Lord Browne, the chairman of L1 Energy and former CEO of BP, who is going to share with us a few thoughts about these issues of climate change science, and what can or what should the oil and gas industry do in that context of maybe a big transition in the energy sector and our economies in general.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's very late in the day, and I think if we stick to our timetable, we have 12 minutes together. So let me reduce my remarks to very few things. The first is, I think that most people like to talk about topics for which they have solutions and where they can align most of the people with them with the solution that they're talking about. And so, for example, if we were talking about climate change as a consumer goods industry, we'd have everyone participating and competing with each other to produce more solutions to create better products which are better for the resilience of the world. And I think there's clear evidence that that's the case. In the case of the oil and gas industry, the reverse is true. We know, I think, because so many people have shared with us the fact that there is a problem called, and it's not about a problem about the planet, it's a problem about saving humanity. The planet will look after itself as the climate changes. So we know that. What we don't know is how to solve it from our point of view, and we certainly don't have an aligned consensus. So that makes it a very weak position to be in as an industry. I like to think that we could make our position stronger. And I think we need to, because public debate is now very much focusing, I think, on the really full cost of hydrocarbons. So if we just take the Council of Economic Advisors pricing on CO2, and a ton of coal, I think, if it starts at $40 a ton, ends up, if you add in the value of the CO2 emitted and the damage to human health, at around $200 a ton. And people are thinking about that and saying, what do we do about that? Maybe we should punish people, extract value, extract taxes, do things which actually fully reflect the full cost to humanity of using these different sources of hydrocarbons. The second thing people are thinking about is a lot of discussion, a lot of attempts. I've been in these attempts myself over many years to make a sensible, long-term contribution from alternative energy sources. I think this is something which needs a lot of attention. It needs far more research and development. I've been part of a proposal to Paris to multiply global R&D in this area by a factor of 10. And I think that would still not be a tremendous amount of money. It would be the equivalent of taking on an Apollo project to go to the moon, but in the case of energy. So these are issues, they're concerns, and I have a strong feeling that it's always good, from my point of view, if you have a challenge which it becomes a threat, you should lean into it rather than step out of it. And I think leaning into it is what we should be doing. My second point, therefore, is about the topic of stranded assets and what we should do about it. I have a sense that the debate is alive and well. Certainly, I know of many people who are convinced that all assets will be stranded. But there are assets and there are assets. And I think it's important that we spend time again and again saying what we mean by an asset. So if OECD is an indicator long run for the rest of the world, we have, of course, reduced our hydrocarbon consumption in OECD over a decade, compared with a decade ago. We've reduced our consumption of oil, consumption of coal, and have increased our consumption of gas. So therefore, we have become a lighter hydrocarbon general economy. So we have to think about, well, what actually is stranded, even if it were stranded. It's not as simple as it seems, and I have a feeling that we could do much better in describing that. The third point I want to make is that I do believe that industries really come and they go, depending on their ability to connect with society. And if you look at a right connection, the way in which you look at the regulation, the sense that you're actually serving society. In other words, you put yourself in the position of someone receiving what you're doing, and you do that correctly, that's good. If you do it badly, we estimate, and I've been working with McKinsey on this, that some 30% of the value of a company is at risk. And if you don't believe me, just look at the track of the stock of Volkswagen recently. It's exactly that. And I think that many people look at the energy industry and they really don't believe any form of public statement that's made that goes in the line of improving people's lives, making the world a better place. And they don't believe that has anything to do with the business of the energy business. And that is very problematic. Most people think that we're here to do something quite reversed, and that's not something which I think is very resilient. So I think we need to think about how we can not risk the value that we have, the 30%, and actually look at the other way. The companies, certainly in other industries, have found that those who engage with society radically actually make more money than those that don't. And long-run studies show that that's about 20%. And I see no reason why, over a decade, I see no reason why these sorts of observations should not apply to the energy industry as a whole, in particular the oil and gas industry. A few comments, ladies and gentlemen. I've used almost half the time. I think we're doing Q&A.
Thank you. I would have a couple of questions before I open it to the audience. You mentioned stranded assets, which is a lively debate. Another lively debate, which is kind of related is the divestment debate. Some people say that if oil companies do not divest from unsustainable resources, then investors should divest from those oil companies. And what do you think of this divestment debate?
Investors have divested and reinvested from time to time. Everyone from South African stocks during the era of apartheid through to tobacco companies and arms manufacturers. So these are opinions of the beneficiaries, or more importantly, the managers of funds who work for beneficiaries. I think the question again is one which is, what do we do to demonstrate that we are doing something really worthwhile? And it is not true that all hydrocarbons are the same. We need, I think, to be very clear about that. Oil and gas are very different. Gas is very different from oil is very different from coal, and coal is very different from wood. So it's very, we have to be, I think, much more precise about what we say. And therefore, I think people can make up their own minds about whether we're actually working in service of the world, and therefore we should be invested in, or working against the interests of the world, in which clearly people have an option to divest the stock.
Regarding the future business model of an oil and gas company, you mentioned that we need to do more R&D into the field of new energies.
Someone does.
I didn't mean the industry. Someone needs to do more R&D into new energy. Regarding the oil companies themselves, there are basically two schools. One that says oil companies should invest in renewable energy, in wind, in solar, perhaps in biofuel, in hydrogen, and so on, to accompany the transition towards a low carbon world. While other people say, well, oil companies don't know much about solar or wind or hydrogen, and therefore they should refrain from doing that and perhaps pay more dividends to their investors, and the investors will find the right vehicles and the right companies to invest in to favor a low carbon economy. Do you have a preference or a position between these two schools?
Well, there's no right or wrong, of course. It depends on how you assess the capability of getting the right competencies to do a different thing as you see your industry changing. After all, I think most telecom companies now think of themselves not as purely in telecoms, but actually in providing content. It's something which is brand new for them, and they're building competencies. The same, I think, with us, that some people will feel that they should and other people won't. I think all oil and gas companies of really any size have to work on creating options for the future. And those options are either longer term reserves, different forms of business, infrastructure, midstream, even petrochemicals and refining. These are all different options for the future, and playing the options together, including renewables, is something that a company can do if it wishes to do. I have experience in both building a renewable energy company in BP. It's an option for the future. It was a choice at the time, and also leading, I think, the world's largest renewable energy private equity fund, the world's largest one. It eventually invested $10 billion. It's now in the process of liquidation, of course. So both are all valid models. The key is obviously to pick the right piece of business at the right time and to invest in the right piece of R&D at the right time, like any business.
You mentioned the image and reputation of the oil industry, which is not very good, quite frankly. Isn't it too late for the oil industry? I was struck by the reactions after the letter European oil companies sent about pricing carbon a couple of months ago, by the negative reactions of the general press about it's too little, it's too late, there's a hidden agenda. This morning we heard the presentation by Ben van Beurden of Shell, who again emphasized the need for pricing carbon, and I saw just a couple of hours ago, the press release from Greenpeace saying it would be costly distraction from meaningful action. Isn't it too late for the oil industry, or how can the oil industry manage to get back into the debate?
Sure. I mean, I think I've recently published a book only 10 days ago called Connect, which is where I did in conjunction with two people who did research for me in McKinsey. And we based it on well over 100 interviews, 80 of which were used, and a lot of analysis about trends in how people think about industries over history. I think it's clear that as long as the minority of people don't like you, you are reasonably safe. There's a debate. If the majority don't like you, you are close to the end, because everything begins to get more and more difficult. Regulators will respond, of course, to the political runes that they see. So the question is, where are we at that tipping point? And I think to simply say, well, it's always been like that, or it's a big cycle and we're down, is not a good idea, because then something happens which is quite dramatic. We were very close to that tipping point with banker bashing. You know, we do need banks, but we need the right sort of banks. And I think people know we need oil and gas. It is one of the great ways of getting people out of poverty, in amongst other things. But we need the right form of oil and gas. And that's why I think we can't assume that one-off events or two-off events or even 10-off events will change attitudes very quickly. We should expect that people will say, well, we are talking our own script. You know, we are saying it because in those deathless words in England, they would say that, wouldn't they? You know, and so we have, I think, very different. We actually have to do something, and we have to say it in a different way, and I think we have to have other people saying it on our behalf. It's all very well us saying, we're going to do something. It'd be much better if Greenpeace said, yes, actually they're doing something which makes a difference.
And my last question would be, and then I'll open to the floor. You mentioned the consumer goods industry, you mentioned the telecoms industry. There's an iconic example of a company which managed to, through innovation, constant innovation, to stay in the forefront and grow. I'm talking about Apple, who grow from a small PC company to the #1 market cap in the world. It's an iconic example of an incumbent turning into a leader in the new industry. Do you see an Apple of energy emerging? And if, I mean, no.
Not yet.
No.
But I'm sure there will be one.
And if there's one, what would their iPhone be?
Who knows? I think I'd turn it around the other way. It seems to me that if you could build, I think, what economists call positional goods, where actually whatever they are, because you make them and you are them, people want them, then I think you can make a breakthrough. And maybe someone here, someone in one energy company can do that. I think that's very important. Otherwise, I think if I can pick the other extreme of this, I go to a lot of places where people say, well, the energy companies, they of course will be Uberized, you know, and we may well be that. I think there are a lot of interesting points. We do know, for example, there's plenty of oil and gas around, whether it's in the hands of companies or state companies or governments. I mean, in the long run, it doesn't make any difference. But there's plenty of it around. There are plenty of needs around. It's about delivering it in the right way, I think, with the right sense of place in society.
Okay, I have a first question there.
Hello,
if
Alex.
You can introduce yourself, please.
Sorry, Alex Pashley, Climate Home. Thank you for giving this important speech, Lord Browne. It was reported in September that you were leading, or you were involved in an investigation of how fossil fuel majors could show leadership before the Paris summit. It's called critical resource. I was interested if you could give us an update on this, and if you were going to make any pronouncements before Paris and what they might contain.
No, I'm one of many people. It's not yet ready, and we don't quite know what it's going to contain. The major thing I did for Paris was to be part of something actually called the Apollo program, where we are trying to persuade people that at a governmental level, so the state, the proper role of the state is to take risks where the risks exceed those which can be taken commercially, to increase the amount of R&D in renewables, in particular in solar, from globally $1.5 billion to $15 billion a year, but more importantly, 150 billion over 10 years. That actually sounds like a lot of money, but actually isn't. And we recommended further that it be done through an international institution, such as, for example, the IEA, so that people could share the IP. So that was the real recommendation.
There will be some release from the critical resource.
You have to ask critical resource, but I believe there will be.
Any other question? Somebody there.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Jay Eden from Energy Intelligence. I was just wondering what your view was with OPEC only having 2 countries which have sent INDCs to United Nations ahead of the deadline. What do you think that says of the oil-producing countries and their views on global warming? Thank you.
Well, I don't know what it says at the moment. We have to see, I think, what the participation of everybody is post the Paris conference. Conferences, they come and they go. There have been lots of them. I think we need to test this to see what comes out, and more importantly, what people do with it after it comes out. I think the world is a little exhausted about having statements of intent. There have been some which have been delivered, and we need to see what happens next. Whether there will be some consideration of carbon taxes or carbon pricing of some sort, and who does what about it, I think remains to be seen.
To follow up on that question, what is there to expect from the Paris conference reasonably?
Well, I hope we'll see 1 or 2 things that can actually be delivered and shown to be delivered, which is important. There have been some deliveries of the earlier commitments on carbon and things like that. The question now is much more not a philosophical one, but can you actually deliver and can you make a difference? So I'd like to see something on, I certainly would absolutely like to see something on R&D, and I think some consideration of how full costing begins to go into the price of carbon and other energy resources, including, it's not just carbon, I think it is actually the health impacts, which are quite important, and that recently came to the fore again with this debate on Volkswagen leading to a debate on diesel and whether it was a right and proper decision to have diesel as a preferred fuel in Europe.
Please.
Lord Browne. Lord Browne, you, referring to your book, Connect, and the tipping point that companies are now facing, are you optimistic that the fossil fuel companies, where are they? Are they going over?
Well, I think they're some of the most untrusted, if I'm not mistaken, in all the surveys. I think it is the case that almost at the bottom, if not the bottom, of the least trusted of industries and companies and CEOs. So I think there's plenty of room for improvement, therefore. And I also think that the industry is filled with extraordinarily capable people, very intelligent, very astute, and very worldly wise. I think now it's a matter of taking the challenge here, which is can you make a truly modern organization fit for the middle of the 21st century, and that will take someone somewhere to appear as a leader. And I'm very hopeful that that will be the case, because there's plenty of pressures in society to say, actually, we do need something different. There are plenty of people who get interviewed who say, actually, it's a dying industry. We don't want that. They're induced by money sometimes, but it's more than that you need to get great people to come and join you. So they're induced to believing it's yesterday's industry, divestiture, stranded assets. All these things do not help, do not help. I think someone somewhere needs to build a very different, not spin, but actually a positive approach to some of these points. And that person probably should be reasonably independent.
Go ahead.
And how optimistic are you on your suggestion around R&D in the Apollo project, which seems eminently sensible?
So I'm reasonably optimistic if we could find a proper institutional structure to put the money in, which I hope the IEA would be. I mean, it's going to have to include China, and there's some work to include China in some form of place in the IEA. The IEA was set up before China was an important part of the world. So the important parts of the world need to be involved here. So I'm optimistic. It may take a couple of goes. This is not a lot of money, but correctly deployed, it can do things that we don't understand at the moment, which is called breakthroughs. We just don't understand at the moment.
Are you thinking of a particular energy or form of, like CCS, for example? Do you think it's part of the solution?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think there's a long way to go with trying to engineer it at a cost that makes sense and in a place which really will contain CO2 permanently. But there's plenty of research which can be done on solar. There's plenty of research still that can be done on wind, I think, and also on understanding, notably, the transmission of power also from wind to the consumer. And making sure that we really do invest in places where there are the right resources to be used for alternative energy. I think it is remarkable that there have been investments made where clearly the sun doesn't shine very often and the wind doesn't blow very often. It would be like drilling where there is no sedimentary basin.
Is there any other question? I would ask my very last question. It's my privilege as being the moderator. Regarding carbon pricing, do you have a position in the rather technical but not so technical debate of whether a tax or a market is better?
Well, of course, I would be induced to say a market because it would be very good to get optimal allocation of resources. And we're all taught about that, I think, and we're taught also that if you give governments lots of taxes, it's not wholly clear that they'll spend it wisely. So on that theoretical balance, we go for markets, but as a practical matter, because it's easier to regulate, to measure, you go for taxes. So I predict that taxes will prevail over markets.
So I guess it was the last question. I thank you very much, and we all thank you. And